Hello, this is the Lord's Legion and welcome to a brand new movie review, and as you can see, this is a part of the series known as The Path to Infinity War, where I'm going to be looking back at each and every film within the Marvel Cinematic Universe up until the release of Avengers Infinity War. And finally we've reached to phase 2, in which we're going to begin with what I would consider to be the most divisive film in the entire MCU, which is of course Iron Man 3. And I think it's going to be impossible to review this film without mentioning some spoilers, so without further ado, let's begin with this review. So Iron Man 3 takes place almost immediately after the Avengers, and now that Tony Stark has witnessed some aliens as well as pretty much the bigger universe, Tony has become more obsessed with creating suits so that he can solve pretty much any situation, and in turn does ruin his relationship with Pepper Potts as well as Rhodey Rhodes and pretty much everyone else. However, when a terrorist attack takes place in which was orchestrated by the Mandarin, it is up to Tony Stark to suit up once again as Iron Man and take down the Mandarin. However, not everything is as it seems, as this is a more personal story for Tony Stark. Now, like I mentioned earlier, this is easily the most divisive film within the MCU, as well as the most divisive film in the Iron Man trilogy, because people either love the film or think that's the worst thing to come out of the MCU. And which camp do I fit in? Well, I'm just going to say this right here now. I absolutely love Iron Man 3, and I'm going to go one step further and say that Iron Man 3 is by far my favourite Iron Man film in the trilogy. And trust me, I really love Iron Man 1, but to me, Iron Man 3 has that slight edge purely because it's a more personal story for Tony Stark. And speaking of Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. has delivered quite possibly his best performance as Tony Stark, because we actually get to see the character in a more psychological perspective, and we do see him in a more vulnerable state. And I have heard that many people don't like this portrayal of Tony Stark in the film, mainly because he seemed too vulnerable and has made multiple mistakes. But to me, this is character development done right. Tony Stark is only a human just like the rest of us, and he does make a lot of mistakes. And people keep complaining about Tony Stark suffering from anxiety attacks, but again, he's a human, he has seen a lot of shit and he's still trying to deal with it all. And what I really love about this movie is the message that Tony learns at the very end, in that it's not the armor that makes Iron Man, but Tony Stark himself, and that his greatest gifts isn't just his armor or even his money, but his intelligence. And honestly, I really love Tony Stark in this movie, because in the end Tony Stark is a badass with or without the suit. Gwyneth Paltrow was also pretty great as Pepper Potts, because unlike Iron Man 2, in which she was nothing more but a complete bitch, she was actually pretty useful in the plot, and she had wonderful chemistry with Tony Stark. Don Cheadle has once again performed a pretty good performance as Rhodey Rhodes, and although I wish he was in the Iron Patriot suit a little more, he did have a fair bit to do in this movie, so in my eyes he wasn't completely wasted. And now I may as well just talk about the entire Mandarin Twist, and I'm just gonna go ahead and say this, but I really love the twist, because this is the first time the MCU did something really creative with its villain instead of making him just another punching bag. And the whole concept of the Mandarin just being an idea was executed very well. And I know that this twist did piss a lot of people off purely because we didn't get to see the real Mandarin, but it never really bothered me in the slightest, because to me the Mandarin was always a terrible villain to begin with. And this whole Mandarin twist was the best thing to ever happen to the actual character. And in terms of performance, Ben Kingsley did a phenomenal job as the quote-unquote Mandarin, and he was also incredibly hilarious as the British actor by the name of Trevor Slattery. And then we also have Guy Pearce as Aldrich Killian, and I honestly think that he was a pretty good villain as well. His motivations made sense, and his plan was admittedly ingenious. And honestly, I think he did a much better job as a slimier version of Tony Stark than Justin Hammer in Iron Man 2. Although I do think that the villain does lose some points for being yet another extremist guy who is just all the more crazy. But regardless, I don't think he's a terrible villain at all. And I also have to give props to the little kid in this movie, because he wasn't an unlikable turd, which is pretty rare when it comes down to child actors. And we had just enough scenes with the kid to the point where he was used sparingly. Now, although we don't get to see Tony Stark as Iron Man for very long in this movie, whenever we do get to see some Iron Man action, it is pretty top notch. And the special effects in this movie are just as wonderful as they are in the entire trilogy. The mansion attack within the second act, although flawed, was a pretty gripping moment within the film. Could it have been executed a little better? Certainly, but from what we've got, it was still an enjoyable moment regardless. And the final climax featuring all of the other armors was just an amazing spectacle. Sure, I wish I got to see a bit more from each individual armor, but it was really cool to see Tony Stark jumping in from suit to suit. Because again, it does perfectly utilize Tony Stark's intelligence. But the main reason why I love Iron Man 3 so much is because it pretty much succeeded where Iron Man 2 failed. Because we actually get to see Tony Stark on a psychological level. And the character really does develop more as the film progresses, to the point where we see different shades of Tony Stark's personality. And I love how Iron Man 3 perfectly balanced both the personal aspects of the story as well as the action. And when you look at Iron Man 3 as a whole, despite some little issues, I think it's a solid film on its own, and a wonderful conclusion to the Iron Man trilogy. And I do get that many people don't like this movie purely because of the Mandarin Twist, as well as the fact that it's completely different in comparison to the other two Iron Man films. And honestly, I think people should give Iron Man 3 another chance, because I feel like majority of the criticism isn't warranted for this movie. And plus, Iron Man 3 is one of these movies where the more I watch it, the more I love it. And so for my final verdict for Iron Man 3, I'm going to go ahead and give it a 9 out of 10. Even though I did mention that I do prefer this film over Iron Man 1, it isn't by a large margin. But because of how this film perfectly executes Tony Stark's character in a more psychological level, that does give it a slight edge over Iron Man 1 in my opinion. So what do you think of Iron Man 3? Do you think that it's an underrated gem, or do you believe that it's one of the worst things to come out of the MCU? Comment below and share some thoughts. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.